Hello. This is the third Sunday of Lent in 2018. That would be March the 4th of 2018. We'll have a little bit of a scripture readings to start with, and commentary, and some little bit of a homily. And the first reading is that passage that probably most of us memorized as kids in grade school, that section of Exodus chapter 20 that has to deal with the Ten Commandments. In those days, God delivered all these commandments. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not leave unpunished anyone who takes his name in vain. Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother, that you may have a long life in the land which Yahweh your God is giving you. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or ass, nor anything else that belongs to him. The word of the Lord. The second reading is that passage from 1 Corinthians that many of us are quite familiar with, because in a way Paul answers how come Jews and even Gentiles aren't accepting the faith of Jesus. And so in a very brief little passage, Paul kind of treats that. Brothers and sisters, he writes, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, Jews and Greeks alike, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The word of the Lord. It's interesting that the gospel from John, from chapter 2, contains Jesus purifying the temple. Now, this is also in the synoptics in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John gives a totally different interpretation of that event than does the other evangelists. Since the Passover of the Jews was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as the money changers seated there. He made a whip out of cords and drove them all out of the temple area with the sheep and oxen, and spilled the coins of the money changers, and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves he said, Take these out of here, and stop making my Father's house a marketplace. His disciples recalled the words of Scripture, Zeal for your house will consume me. At this the Jews answered and said to him, What sign can you show us for doing this? Jesus answered and said to them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said, This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the Scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. While he was in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, many began to believe in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. But Jesus would not trust himself to them, because he knew them all, and did not need anyone to testify about human nature. He himself understood it well. The Gospel of the Lord. I mentioned in the written commentary this week that a rabbi friend of mine once in one of my classes answered a question that I had for him. This was several years ago, when all those displays of the Ten Commandments were in the news. Some courts were saying you have to take them out of here, especially on public property and everything like that. Anyway, so I asked him, I said, what do you as a Jew think about all these Christian displays of the Ten Commandments? And he smiled and said, well, I hate to tell you, Roger. And then he said something that I was pretty certain he was going to say. He said, I don't know what you're doing advertising for us Jews. That's our covenant, not yours. But we don't really begrudge you of giving us free publicity. That's why I'm sort of amazed when I go into Catholic churches. We have one or two in our diocese where they're in the vestibule of the church. I taught for years in a cafeteria of a Catholic school that had them prominently displayed in the dining room. And you have the 10 Commandments rather nicely there. Usually you don't have them all written out. You just have 2 parallel tablets with 10 Roman numerals on them. But why are those in Christian places? They are a covenant that pertained, as we saw in that first reading today, to people whom Yahweh liberated from Egypt. Yahweh, I hate to tell you, never liberated my ancestors from Egypt. He might have liberated them from Belgium or from Czechoslovakia or Germany, but those are not my ancestors. Those are the Jews, the chosen people, who make this covenant with Yahweh. And it's kind of fascinating because Paul of Tarsus would probably be turning over in his grave if he saw all these displays of the 10 Commandments in Gentile Christian churches. He fought a real battle over whether or not Gentile, non-Jewish Christians had to keep the covenant that the Jews had made with Yahweh. And Paul rather nicely said, no, they don't have to keep it. He didn't say they could break the 10 Commandments, but there's 617 laws, more than just the 10 regulations, 613, I'm sorry, more than just the 10 regulations that we have in today's first reading. And what he's saying is that Jews have to keep those. We presume to his dying day, Paul of Tarsus, as a Jew, never knew what a BLT tasted like. He was a Jew. He could not break the covenant he and his ancestors had made with Yahweh. But a lot of people didn't make that covenant with Yahweh, who still decided they would follow the faith of Jesus of Nazareth. Would they have to be Jews first before they could be Christians? Would they have to okay this agreement with Yahweh that the Jews had made on Mount Sinai 1,200 or so years before the birth of Jesus? Paul said no. They could simply go back to Genesis when you have that very famous passage in chapter 15 where I'll get it eventually, Abraham makes a covenant with Yahweh. That was probably 400 or 500 years before the covenant on Mount Sinai. And in that passage, the only responsibility that Abraham had was to put his faith in Yahweh. In other words, to give himself over totally to whatever God asked of him. That was an act of righteousness, as the sacred author said. And so when we have that, you don't have to be Jewish to do that. You don't have to follow 613 laws in the book of Exodus or Deuteronomy to carry through on that. All you have to do is be a faithful individual. And Paul rather nicely said, that's all that a follower of Jesus has to do. I don't know why they're putting these signs of 10 Commandments in Christian Gentile places. It doesn't make any sense. That would be like me telling you, why don't you put a copy of my contract that I sign every semester with Southwestern Illinois College on your living room wall? You're going to say, that's your contract, that's your commitment, that's your covenant, and vice versa, their agreement with you from that community college. That's not my agreement. I don't even work there. And so by us putting up pictures, putting up bas-reliefs, putting up different memorials of the 10 Commandments, we don't really understand what happened in the early Christian community. There was such a bitterness at times when Paul argued with Christians, very conservative Christians, who said, you still have to follow those laws if you want to be a follower of Jesus. The whole letter to the Galatians was written over that issue. And Paul gets so angry at times with these Judaizers, the Christians who said you had to be circumcised before you could be a Christian or follower of Jesus, where at one point he says, I hope that before they force Gentiles to be circumcised, that they become circumcised themselves And then he says something that's not in any scripture reading that we have. He said, when that happens, when they get circumcised, I hope the knife slips. For some reason, we've never found a place in the liturgy for that particular passage from Galatians. But some scholars even think that it's very possible that Paul was set up for martyrdom by these Judaizers. The conservatives, again, who said you have to be Jewish before you can be Christian, that they turned him into Roman authorities. That is not really a fake news type situation. Many very legitimate scholars hold, that battle was going on constantly between those who said you had to be Jewish before you could be Christian. That's why in that passage from 1 Corinthians that I read, Paul rather nicely, says, how come Jews and Gentiles don't accept the faith of Jesus? And he says, Jews think it's foolishness. And the foolishness is that in order to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to die with Jesus. Paul says a lot of followers of Judaism think that's not really a good argument to be a follower of Jesus. And Greeks, the Gentiles, they basically say, we're in the wisdom business, and it ain't too smart to go out and die. Smartness is to stay alive. Paul rather nicely says, we preach a dying and a rising with Jesus. That's our covenant, that we're willing to basically say, if we follow the faith of Jesus and wish to attain the life that he gives us, we first have to die. And as we know from our writings in the Christian scriptures, the chief way of dying is giving yourself to others. That's why even that gospel today, even though it describes the same event, the cleansing of the temple, it does it differently than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. First of all, this is in chapter 2 of John. In the Synoptic Gospels, the other three, Jesus doesn't perform that action of getting rid of these buyers and traders and everything in the temple till just a couple of days before he dies. Where in John's Gospel, he does it at the very beginning of his ministry, not at the end of it. And the reason why John changes it around, if you notice, John doesn't have that line in there about, you've made this house of prayer into a den of thieves. He skips that totally. The other Gospels quote Jeremiah's thing about the temple being the den of thieves. John simply says, Jesus did this action as a sign, a symbol, that we don't need the temple anymore. That from here on out, what the temple provided, the risen Jesus now provides. He, as in that gospel, is the new temple. That's why when you look at that from this direction, you begin to realize that there is an argument going on with Judaism in John's gospel. And I always say, you can go back and quote that song that I remember from Annie Get Your Gun when I was a kid. That song that goes, anything you can do, I can do better, I can do anything better than you. That would be the background music for John's gospel. Because he believes Christians can always have a deeper faith than Jews. Christians are always doing things better than Jews are doing. That's why throughout his gospel, Jesus constantly gives signs in which he replaces things of Judaism with Christianity. For instance, when the wedding feast at Cana takes place, which took place right before this cleansing of the temple passage in John, as the scholars say, that was replacing the water of Judaism with the wine of Christianity. Always, that song's in the background. Anything you can do, I can do better. Our problem is, most of us don't understand what the covenant we have made with God through Jesus consists in. It doesn't consist in the 10 Commandments. It doesn't consist in 613 regulations. That covenant basically consists in an agreement with Jesus that, like him, will give ourselves for others. And what's interesting, as we'll see when we approach Holy Thursday, a lot of us don't even do the thing that Jesus expected us to do as an outward sign we made the covenant. Just like a wedding ring is an outward sign that somebody made a covenant with somebody else in marriage. And if we want to look very nicely at those 2 tablets of stone, that might be an outward sign that whoever has those made a covenant with Yahweh on Mount Sinai. We might have to wait, so have some patience until we get to Holy Thursday, where I will again stress things I've stressed in these commentaries quite frequently. What's the outward sign, and what are the responsibilities that we assume when we make a covenant with the risen Jesus? Sorry to keep you waiting, but it'll be worth it. Thank you.